The United States of America we know today did not exist until the late 1700s. Before that time, America was split into 13 colonies controlled by Great Britain, under the rule of King George III and the British government known as Parliament. This is the story of how colony life led to the American Revolution and the independence of what is deemed to be one of the greatest modern-day nations. Before discussing the events that sparked the fires of the American Revolution, one must examine the everyday life of the average colonist. One of the reasons so many made the 2-month voyage to America from Europe was to escape religious persecution and to be able to practice freely. Just as the colonies existed, they were divided into 3 main regions. Each had its own unique religious population. In the New England colonies, most were mainly Puritans who lived stricter lifestyles. The middle colonies were a mixture of Quakers, Catholics, Lutherans, Jews, and other religious bodies. The southern colonies mainly included Baptist and Anglican churches. Along with seeking religious freedoms, colonists sought America out to take advantage of her vast natural resources. Farms, businesses, and cities were built. Many thrived economically by selling products to Great Britain. Just as religious culture varied by region, so did the exports. The New England colonies had very poor quality soil, so they became known for shipbuilding, businesses, and fishing. The middle colonies had soil that was rich and produced abundantly. They were known as the bread colonies due to the substantial amount of grain produced, enough to feed all 13 colonies. The southern colonies' mass producer was mainly tobacco and rice. City life in the colonies was unique itself. Picture a major city in your head. Now divide it by at least 10. The average large city back in the colonial days had around 18,000 citizens. There were not very many cities, as roadways were yet to be fully developed. The largest cities in the colonies were Philadelphia, Boston, New York, and Charleston. These cities were rich in resources such as schools, hospitals, shops, churches, and newspapers. Most had ports that helped the cities thrive through exports and imports. However, the majority of colonists led a harder life out on their farms. They had to produce everything they needed for survival by building their own homes to making their own candles and soaps. Work was sun up to sundown, and they rarely took the paths etched out to the cities due to the harsher conditions and the time it took. The colony's architecture was built a bit more eclectically. Within the cities, some buildings were made of brick and stone, others were made with wood. Outside of the cities, farms had simple farmhouses or cabins. The colonies did, however, have their fair share of elite citizens who lived in mansions or on plantations. For the majority of homes, the insides were basic and filled with the necessities to live everyday life. The mansions and plantations were filled with more ornate furnishings and art. The majority of homes had abnormally large fireplaces used to heat the homes and cook. Bathrooms and running water were non-existent, and one had to use an outhouse or a chamber pot as a toilet. Bathing was typically done once a month due to many colonists thought baths were unhealthy. To keep up tidy appearances, one would use a special bowl with a pitcher to wash their faces and hands. Like the economy and religion, education in the colonies depended on what geographical section one resided. In the New England colonies, the large Puritan population that built their society on the Bible valued education. It was thought that Satan kept the illiterate people from the scripture. Up to the age of 8, children learned reading, spelling, and prayers in a special daycare-like school called dame schools. After, boys learned Latin in order to pursue college or learn a trade. Girls learned domestic skills to better serve their future families. 2/3 of Puritan men and women could sign their name. Even though the Middle Colonies highly valued education, it was a bit more difficult to provide it. Local religious groups ran schools and emphasized the practical facets of education. Boys of the lower class typically learned trades and skills, while upper class boys learned languages, history, literature, math, and science, preparing them for university life. Girls were typically tutored at home on household and social skills. Almost half of every middle colonist could sign their name. Finally, in the southern colonies, education typically began at home. Due to the mass quantity of farms and plantations, trips to school were extremely difficult. So, many of the lower class did not attend school. The wealthier plantation children were given tutors and governesses to teach them a variety of subjects and how to run a plantation for the boys and how to run a household and social skills for the girls. Class differences were the most pronounced in the southern colonies. Less than half of the lower class could sign their names, and only 1% of slaves could, due to the fact that educating slaves was non-existent at the time. Colonial life was not always harmonious. From 1754 to 1763, the British fought the French and American Indians over land in America. This war was known as the French and Indian War. In 1763, a treaty was signed ending the war. France lost most of their lands to Britain, who claimed Canada and most of the lands east of the Mississippi. After this long and grueling, costly war, King George III took many actions that led to the revolt and the start of the American Revolution. After the French and Indian War, King George III issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This proclamation prohibited settlers from crossing west of the Appalachian Mountains to prevent further conflict with the natives. This angered many colonists that were told to pack up and to head back to the east of the Appalachians. Many ignored this royal decree. Another way British Parliament decided to recoup the cost of the war was by heavily taxing the colonies. Many colonists felt that this new taxation system was unfair because they had no say or representation. Thus, the term taxation without representation was coined. In 1765, the straw that broke the camel's back for the colonists was the issuance of the Stamp Act. This new act required that colonists buy special paper stamped with the royal seal on every important document, including newspapers and playing cards. This act led to the men in the colonies forming a secret group of networks called the Sons of Liberty. Vowing to fight this new act, riots broke out in the big cities. The Sons of Liberty ran tax collectors out of town, and if they refused, properties of the collectors were destroyed. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act to prevent further riots. This step did not appease the colonists, however. The colonists that remained angered began calling themselves patriots, while the remaining citizens loyal to Britain were called loyalists. Over 4,000 troops were sent to Boston after these riots in order to attempt to keep the peace and prevent revolution. The colonists did not welcome these troops with open arms. In 1770, a mob of colonists gathered in front of a customs house to taunt a soldier. They threw rocks and shouted "Fire!" in order to draw a larger crowd. More soldiers gathered at the customs house, loaded their muskets, and were told not to fire on the mob. However, one soldier panicked and 5 colonists were killed. This incident became known as the Boston Massacre. In order to keep the colonists at bay after this massacre, Parliament repealed the Townshend Acts, taxes placed on all British goods. They excluded, though, the tax on tea. The colonists loved tea and were outraged that the tea tax remained. Patriot leaders following the massacre and the continued tea tax organized a shadow government called the Committee of Correspondence. The Boston Committee of Correspondence decided to handle this new crisis by employing the Sons of Liberty to the Boston Wharf dressed as Native Americans to dump tons of tea into the Boston Harbor. This act of defiance was known as the Boston Tea Party. When King George III caught wind of this defiance, he was furious, and new strict laws governing the colonies were passed. These laws were so harsh they were known by the colonists as intolerable acts. The matter was seen as a blatant rebellion against Britain, so warships were sent to Boston Harbor. After other colonies heard what happened, they all boycotted British goods together. They flew liberty flags on trees that became known as Liberty Trees in acts of defiance. The British soldiers would often cut down the Liberty trees. Some loyalists remained, but a growing number of patriots wanted to be free from British rule. During 1775 and 1776, a famous pamphlet titled Common Sense was written by author Thomas Paine. In these pamphlets, Paine advocated for independence from Great Britain in a clear, non-flowery language. He encouraged the common people to fight for an egalitarian government. Colonists knew a war was looming. Uniting was the only way to defeat the mighty Britain. Delegates from all colonies were invited to Philadelphia on September 5, 1774, for the first ever Continental Congress meeting. 56 delegates met. It was voted to condemn the intolerable acts and pass a Bill of Rights listing the freedoms Americans were entitled to. A new boycott of British goods was set in place along with an association law that was passed. No British goods could be purchased or used. Each colony set up committees of inspection in order to catch violators. The Continental Congress also sent a petition to King George III asking him to protect the rights of his American subjects, hoping to prevent war. Militias were formed and trained as soldiers several times a year. These men were prepared to fight at a moment's notice and became known as Minutemen. On April 18, 1775, after hearing about potential weapons being stored in the town of Concord, Massachusetts, the British Army made a plan to secretly travel by night to seize the hidden weapons. Little did they know, Patriot spies were everywhere. That night, a Boston patriot learned of the secret plan and climbed to the tower of his church, lighting 2 lanterns for those in the distance to see. The signal meant one thing: the British were coming. Paul Revere saw the signal, and with another colonist, William Dawes, they leapt onto their horses and rode into the night to the towns of Lexington and Concord, exclaiming, "To arms! To arms! The regulars are coming!" The regulars were none other than the British soldiers. After a cold journey across the Charles River, the British marched 16 miles to Lexington. On the dawn of April 19, 1775, they arrived to meet a small band of Minutemen waiting to attack. 8 Minutemen lost their lives, but gave the other Patriots and Minutemen time to gather in Concord. When the British arrived in Concord, they had no idea what awaited them. They were ambushed from all sides, and as shots rang out and blood was spilled, the British realized that they were outnumbered. A retreat back towards Boston was made. The first shots that fired at Lexington and Concord became known as the shot heard around the world. This was the first official conflict that ignited the fuse that would become the American Revolution. The war ended with the defeat of the British at Yorktown, Virginia on October 19, 1781. Peace talks began in Paris in 1781 and lasted 2 years. Finally, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris ended the American Revolution. At last, the patriots' dream of a free country to govern as they please had come to fruition, paving the way for the creation of the United States of America.